The massive space station called Nexus Prime hung in the darkness between stars like a giant metal flower. Its lights twinkled against the black sky, and ships from dozens of different worlds docked at its many arms. Today was not like other days. Today, representatives from across the galaxy had come here for one reason. War was coming, and they needed to stop it before everything they knew was destroyed. Admiral Korath stood in the main meeting hall, his forearms crossed as he watched the delegates arrive. The hall was huge, with a curved ceiling that showed the stars outside. Seats of different shapes and sizes filled the room, made for beings who looked nothing like each other. Some needed water tanks. Others required heat lamps. A few sat on platforms that floated in the air. The first to arrive were the Krillian pack. They came through the doors like a storm. Their leader, Alpha Grimjaw, stood 8 feet tall and was covered in thick gray fur. Scars crossed his face and arms, telling stories of 100 battles. His yellow eyes swept the room, looking for threats. Behind him came 3 more warriors, each one looking like they could tear apart a small building with their bare hands. "We bring our finest killers," Grimjaw announced, his voice like grinding stone. "Warriors who have never known defeat. The blood of our enemies waters the soil of 17 worlds." Next came the Zephyrian collective. They moved as one, their steps perfectly matched. Their bodies were more machine than flesh now. With metal arms and glowing red eyes, cables ran under their pale skin, connecting them to the vast computer mind they all shared. "Unit designation, Prime Combat Efficiency," their speaker announced in a voice that sounded like it came from a computer. "Battle success rate, 97.8%. Weakness probability, 0.01%. The Thermal Empire's representatives entered in a cloud of heat and steam. General Pyrion's body was made of living crystal that glowed red-hot. When he walked, the metal floor under his feet began to melt slightly. His officers followed, their bodies burning with inner fire. "The flames of war call to us," Pyrion said, his voice crackling like a fire. "We have turned enemy worlds to ash and glass. Our heat melts both steel and bone." One by one, the other species arrived. The Void Hunters came in silence, their black armor drinking in the light around them. The Stone Guard marched in formation, their rock-like bodies making the floor shake with each step. The Star-Touched floated in, their energy bodies shifting between different colors. Each group brought their most deadly warriors. Each one spoke of victories and enemies destroyed. The air in the room grew thick with the promise of violence. Admiral Korath raised his hands for silence. The room grew quiet, though the tension could be felt like electricity. "We all know why we are here," he said. "The Devourers have consumed 12 star systems in the last year. They do not stop. They do not negotiate. They eat everything in their path. Our combined fleets have failed to stop them. Now we must try something else." A holographic image appeared in the center of the room. It showed a dark, twisted world covered in writhing organic shapes. Strange spires reached up from the surface, like the bones of some massive creature. "This is the Queen's world," Korath continued. "The heart of the Devourer swarm. Our intelligence tells us that if we can destroy the Queen, the entire hive mind will collapse. But the world is protected by millions of Devourer warriors. A normal army would be destroyed before it could land." He looked around the room at the assembled warriors. "That is why each of you will contribute 1 warrior to a special strike team. The best of the best. Together, they will infiltrate the Queen's world and end this threat." Grimjaw slammed his fist on his chair. "The pack accepts. Our champion will drink the Queen's blood. The collective calculates mission success probability at acceptable levels," the Zephyrian speaker replied. "Fire will cleanse their world," General Pyrion declared. One by one, each delegation agreed. The room filled with the sounds of approval and war cries. "Very well," Admiral Korath said. "Each of you will bring your chosen warrior to Launch Bay 7 in 3 days. The mission will begin immediately after." As the meeting ended, the delegates began to leave. They spoke among themselves about which warrior they would choose, and how they would claim victory. The air buzzed with excitement and bloodlust. Admiral Korath was about to leave when his aide, a young Nexarian with blue skin, approached him. "Sir, there's one more arrival scheduled," she said, checking her tablet. "The human ship is docking now," Korath nodded. He was curious about Earth's representative. Humans were new to the galactic community, having only joined 5 years ago. Their species was strange, but they had shown surprising ability to adapt and survive. Their ships were crude but effective. Their weapons were simple but deadly. "I wonder what kind of warrior they will bring," Korath said to himself. The human ship was small compared to the others. It docked quietly at the far end of the station. No crowds gathered to watch. No war cries echoed through the halls. The airlock opened with a soft hiss. First came a young human man in a simple blue uniform. He looked nervous as he stepped onto the station. Behind him came a guard, also young, carrying a single small bag. Then came their warrior. Admiral Korath blinked all 4 of his eyes, thinking he must be seeing wrong. The human warrior was a small, elderly female. Her hair was gray and pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple sweater and comfortable shoes. In one hand, she carried a canvas bag. In the other, she held what appeared to be knitting needles. She looked around the docking bay with bright, curious eyes. Then she smiled at the Admiral. "Oh my," she said in a cheerful voice. "What a lovely space station. I'm Margaret Chen. Are you the one in charge here? You look very official with all those arms." Admiral Korath stared at her. This was Earth's warrior? This grandmother who looked like she should be at home making cookies instead of preparing for the most dangerous mission in galactic history? The human diplomat cleared his throat. "Admiral Korath, may I present Earth's representative for the mission?" "Oh." Margaret adjusted the bag on her shoulder and walked toward the Admiral. "Don't mind the young ones," she said. "They're always so formal. I brought some cookies if you're hungry. The trip here was quite long, and I imagine you've been in meetings all day." Oh, the next day, the main briefing room filled with the chosen warriors from across the galaxy. Each one was a legend among their people. Grimjaw, of the Krillian Pack, had killed a space whale with his bare hands. Combat Unit 7 of the Zephyrian Collective had single-handedly destroyed an entire rebel station. General Pyrian had melted through a mountain to end a war, and then there was Margaret Chen, sitting in the front row with her knitting bag in her lap. The other warriors stared at her. Some looked confused. Others seemed angry. A few appeared to be trying not to laugh. Alpha Grimjaw was the first to speak. He stood up, his massive form casting a shadow across the room. "This is an insult," he growled, pointing at Margaret with one clawed finger. "The pack has sent our greatest killer. We have honored the sacred war bond. But the humans mock us with this, and this." "Grandmother," Margaret said helpfully, looking up from the sock she was knitting. "Though you can call me Maggie if you prefer." Grimjaw's yellow eyes flashed with anger. "We do not fight alongside the weak and old. Send this female away and bring us a real warrior." Combat Unit 7's red eyes focused on Margaret. The Zephyrians' internal computers whirred as they calculated her fighting ability. Physical strength, minimal. Combat training, undetected. Weapon proficiency, 0. This unit calculates survival probability at 3%. "Oh dear," Margaret said, counting stitches. 3% seems a bit high. Don't you think? I haven't been in a proper fight since I argued with Mrs. Henderson about her dog digging in my garden. General Pyrian's crystal body glowed brighter. The flames of war do not warm the hearths of the elderly. This one will turn to ash at the first sign of battle. Margaret looked up at him with interest. "My goodness, you're quite warm, aren't you? You must have trouble with the cold. I could knit you a nice scarf, though I suppose it might catch fire." The other warriors began to mutter among themselves. The Void Hunters whispered in their strange language. The Stone Guard's leader, a being called Crusher, shook his massive head. Even the Star-Touched, who rarely showed emotion, seemed disturbed. Admiral Korath entered the room. followed by several aides carrying data tablets and holographic projectors. He looked around at the assembled warriors, his gaze stopping briefly on Margaret, who waved at him cheerfully. "Welcome, champions of the galaxy," Korath began. "Today, we will discuss the details of your mission. The fate of all civilized worlds rests in your hands." He activated the main holographic display. The image of the Queen's world appeared, rotating slowly. It looked even more horrible up close. The surface was covered in writhing masses of organic material. Strange towers twisted up from the ground like infected wounds. Dark creatures moved between the structures. "The Devourer Queen lives in the central hive complex," Korath explained. "It is located here." A red dot appeared on the planet's surface. The complex is protected by 7 layers of defenses. Each layer contains thousands of warrior drones. Grimjaw leaned forward, studying the display. "How many defenders?" "Our estimates suggest between 50 and 100 million combat-ready devourers on the planet's surface." Combat Unit 7's eyes flashed. "Acceptable odds for elite units. Recommend frontal assault with maximum firepower." "That would be suicide," Korath replied. "Even your combined abilities could not fight through such numbers. That is why stealth is essential." He changed the display to show the planet's interior. Tunnels and chambers spread through the ground like the inside of an anthill. "You will infiltrate through these maintenance tunnels. They are used by worker drones to service the hive systems. Once inside, you must make your way to the Queen's chamber." Margaret raised her hand politely. "Excuse me, dear, but what do these worker drones eat?" Korath looked surprised by the question. "They consume organic matter to fuel the hive's growth." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just curious." "And do they have regular mealtimes?" "Back home, I always found that people get quite cranky when they're hungry and haven't eaten on schedule." Several warriors made sounds of disgust or disbelief. Grimjaw's fur bristled. "This female thinks of meals when we speak of war." "Well," Margaret said mildly, "hungry soldiers don't fight well. I learned that when my husband was in the service. A good meal can make all the difference in morale." Korath continued with the briefing, showing layouts of the hive complex and discussing guard rotations. The warriors asked about weapons, armor, and combat tactics. Margaret continued knitting, but she listened carefully to everything that was said. When the Admiral mentioned that the worker drones operated on 12-hour shifts, Margaret nodded. When he explained that the maintenance tunnels were cleaned every 48 hours, she made a small sound of understanding. When he showed the locations of the food processing centers, she looked up with interest. "The mission will begin in 18 hours, Korath concluded. "You will travel aboard the stealth ship Shadow's Edge. The ship's captain will brief you on insertion procedures once you are underway." As the meeting ended, the warriors began to leave. Many of them continued to stare at Margaret with expressions of disbelief or disgust. Grimjaw stopped beside her chair. "Human female," he said in his rumbling voice. "When the battle begins, stay far from me. I will not be responsible for your death." Margaret looked up at him with a gentle smile. "That's very thoughtful of you, dear. You know, you remind me of my neighbor's dog. He was quite large and fierce-looking, but really just wanted someone to scratch behind his ears." Grimjaw's eyes went wide with shock. He had been compared to many things in his life. Storms, avalanches, death itself. But never to a pet. He stalked away, muttering curses in his native language. Combat Unit 7 approached next. "This unit does not understand human selection criteria. Why were you chosen for this mission?" "ICA 47. Margaret finished a row of stitches before answering. "I suppose because I raised 5 children, managed a household budget for 40 years, and once talked down an armed robber who broke into my house. These achievements do not compute as combat qualifications." "No, I suppose they don't," Margaret agreed. "Would you like a cookie?" "I made them this morning." The Zephyrian stared at her for a long moment, then walked away without responding. General Pyrian was the last to approach. His crystal body had cooled to a dim orange glow. "You will die on that world," he said simply. "We all die eventually, dear," Margaret replied. "The important thing is what we do while we're alive." As the room emptied, Admiral Korath remained behind with Margaret. He sat down in the chair across from her, all four hands folded on the table. "Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, "I must ask, why did your people choose you for this mission? Surely Earth has soldiers, warriors, fighters who would be better suited for this task." Margaret put down her knitting and met his gaze. "They do," she said. "But sometimes the solution to a problem isn't more fighting. Sometimes you need someone who knows how to listen, how to find what's really wrong, and how to fix it." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small tin. "Cookie," she offered. "They're chocolate chip. My grandson's favorite." The stealth ship Shadow's Edge moved through space like a whisper. Its black hull absorbed light and radio waves, making it nearly invisible against the stars. Inside, the strike team prepared for what most of them believed would be their final mission. The ship's common area had been divided into sections for each warrior's needs. Grimjaw sharpened his claws on a metal block, the scratching sound echoing through the ship. Combat Unit 7 stood motionless in a charging station, red lights blinking under his skin. General Pyrian meditated in a heat-sealed chamber, his crystal body glowing white-hot. Margaret sat in a corner, knitting what appeared to be a sweater. She had spread a small blanket on the floor and unpacked supplies from her canvas bag. There were bandages, antiseptic cream, pain medication, energy bars, and several thermoses of what smelled like chicken soup. "Battle preparation appears inefficient," Combat Unit 7 observed, watching her organize small packages of tea. "Oh, this isn't for battle, dear," Margaret replied, holding up a half-finished sleeve. "This is for afterward. People often forget that wars have to end sometime, and then everyone needs to heal." Crusher, the Stone Guard champion, looked down at her with eyes like polished granite. "You speak of healing when we go to bring death. Someone has to think about it," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "And you all look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. Fighting on an empty stomach is never wise." She pulled out a small medical kit and examined it carefully. "Captain, do you know if any of our devourer friends have allergies? I'd hate to accidentally make someone sick. I did not 7,000,000,000,010. I don't about." Captain Voss, a grizzled veteran with cybernetic implants, looked up from the navigation console. "Allergies? They're monsters, not patients. Everyone's someone's child," Margaret replied, packing the medical supplies back into her bag. "Even monsters usually started out as babies who just needed love and proper care." Grimjaw snorted loudly. "The pack shows love through strength. The weak deserve only death. My grandson thought that way when he was little," Margaret said with a smile. "Always fighting, always proving himself. Then one day, he brought home a wounded bird. Spent weeks nursing it back to health, taught him more about strength than any fight ever could." The ship shuddered slightly as they entered the Queen's world's atmosphere. Through the viewports, they could see the horrible landscape below. Rivers of dark liquid flowed between twisted structures. The sky was filled with flying creatures that looked like nightmare insects. "Approaching drop zone," Captain Voss announced. 2 minutes to insertion. The warriors began their final preparations. They checked weapons, adjusted armor, and reviewed the mission plan one last time. Margaret simply stood up, folded her blanket neatly, and shouldered her bag. "Mrs. Chen," Captain Voss said, "you'll be staying on the ship during the assault phase. Once the team has secured the target, we'll call for you to come down." "Oh, that won't be necessary," Margaret replied. "I'll go with them." Grimjaw turned to stare at her. "You will slow us down. You will get us all killed." "I might surprise you," Margaret said. "I've raised 5 teenagers. I know how to be quiet when I need to be." The drop bay doors opened, revealing the alien landscape below. The air that rushed in smelled of decay and something else. Something sick and desperate. One by one, the warriors jumped from the ship. Their insertion pods shot toward the surface like falling stars. Margaret watched them go, then walked calmly to the edge of the bay. "Mrs. Chen," Captain Voss called. "You don't have a pod. Don't worry about me, dear," she called back. "I know another way." The ship's sensors showed the warriors landing near the main tunnel entrance. They immediately encountered heavy resistance. Devourer warriors swarmed from hidden positions, their twisted forms moving with unnatural speed. But Margaret had noticed something during the briefings that the others had missed. The maintenance tunnels had service entrances every few kilometers. Small openings meant for worker drones to enter and exit. Places where an elderly human grandmother might slip in unnoticed. She made her way to the ship's emergency escape pods and selected the smallest one. As the pod launched toward the planet's surface, she knitted calmly, watching the alien landscape grow larger through the small window. The pod landed with a soft thud in a grove of twisted trees near a maintenance facility. Margaret climbed out, brushed dirt off her sweater, and looked around. The air was thick and humid, like a greenhouse that hadn't been properly maintained. She could hear fighting in the distance, the sounds of weapons fire and roaring beasts. The warriors were following the main plan, attacking through the heavily defended entrance. That would draw attention away from where she was going. Margaret walked toward the maintenance facility, studying the strange architecture. Everything was organic, grown rather than built. The walls had a texture like bark, but they pulsed with an inner rhythm, as if the building itself was alive. A small opening in the wall led to a tunnel that sloped downward. The entrance was barely large enough for her to squeeze through, which explained why it wasn't heavily guarded. Devourer warriors were much larger than humans. As she made her way through the tunnel, Margaret encountered her first worker drone. It was about the size of a large dog, with multiple arms and a face that was mostly mouth. It stopped when it saw her, tilting its head with confusion. Margaret had expected this. During the briefing, she had noticed that the worker drones operated on strict schedules. They weren't fighters, they were just trying to do their jobs and feed their families. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich. "You look tired, dear," she said gently. "When did you last have something to eat?" The worker drone stared at the sandwich. Its species had never encountered individual kindness before. In the hive mind, everything was shared. Everything was duty. But this strange alien was offering food, just to her, just because she looked hungry. The drone's mental connection to the hive flickered with confusion. The collective consciousness had no framework for understanding this gesture. An enemy was supposed to attack or flee. They weren't supposed to offer sandwiches. Margaret left the sandwich on the tunnel floor and continued walking. Behind her, the worker drone stared at the food, then carefully picked it up. For the first time in its life, it experienced individual thought, individual choice. The confusion spread through the hive mind like ripples on a pond. Margaret encountered more worker drones as she went deeper into the tunnel system. Each time, she offered food, asked about their well-being, or simply acknowledged them as individuals, rather than parts of a machine. Each small act of kindness created another crack in the collective consciousness. The hive mind, which had operated as one for millions of years, began to experience something it had never known: individual thought. Far above, the warriors continued their assault on the main defenses. They were brave and skilled, but they were fighting the symptoms of the problem, not the cause. Margaret, meanwhile, was doing what she did best. She was caring for those who had been forgotten, listening to those who had never been heard, and treating everyone she met as if they mattered. And deep in the hive's core, the queen began to sense that something was changing. The perfect unity of her consciousness was developing strange variations, new thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere. For the first time in her long existence, the Devourer Queen felt something she didn't understand. Curiosity about this strange disturbance in her realm. The deeper Margaret went into the hive, the more strange things became. The worker drones she met no longer moved with perfect coordination. Some stopped to examine the empty food containers she left behind. Others lingered in tunnels, as if thinking thoughts they had never had before. The tunnel system was like a vast circulatory system, with passages leading in all directions. Margaret followed the ones that felt warm and humid, reasoning that the queen would be in the most life-supporting part of the hive. She had learned long ago that mothers, whether human or alien, usually stayed close to whatever kept their children safe. Above her, she could still hear the distant sounds of battle. The warriors were fighting bravely, but the resistance was growing stronger. The hive was responding to the threat by sending more defenders to stop them. Margaret hoped they would be all right, but she knew that violence alone wouldn't solve this problem. As she walked, Margaret noticed that the walls around her were changing. They became more elaborate, with complex patterns that reminded her of nerve systems or blood vessels. The air grew warmer and smelled different. Not just of decay, but of something else. Something that reminded her of the maternity ward where her grandchildren had been born. She encountered a different type of drone here. These were larger, with gentler faces and arms that ended in what looked like nursing appendages. Caregiver drones. Margaret realized they were tending to something important. One of them approached her, moving slowly and carefully. It made soft chittering sounds that almost sounded like questions. Margaret sat down on the tunnel floor and opened her bag. "You're taking care of babies, aren't you?" she said softly. "I can tell. You have that look that all new mothers get. Tired, worried, but determined to do whatever it takes." She pulled out a small bottle of vitamins and showed it to the caregiver drone. "These help with nutrition. Back home, we give them to pregnant mothers and nursing mothers. They help make healthy babies." The drone tilted its head, studying the bottle with large, dark eyes. Through the hive mind, its confusion spread to thousands of other caregivers throughout the complex. They had never seen an outsider show concern for their young. Margaret left the vitamins and continued deeper into the hive. She was getting close now. She could feel it. The air thrummed with a deep, rhythmic sound, like a massive heartbeat. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that took Margaret's breath away. It was beautiful in a strange, alien way. The ceiling curved high overhead, covered in a pattern that looked like stained glass made of living tissue. Soft light came from everywhere and nowhere, giving the space a peaceful, almost holy feeling. And in the center of it all was the Queen. Margaret had expected a monster. The military briefings had described a creature of pure evil, a being that lived only to consume and destroy. What she found instead was a mother. The Devourer Queen was enormous, yes, but not in a frightening way. She was large the way ancient trees are large, with a presence that spoke of age and wisdom and deep responsibility. Her body was a blend of organic and technological elements, with thousands of thin tendrils connecting her to the walls of the chamber. Through these connections, she monitored and guided the entire hive. Around the base of her throne-like body were hundreds of eggs, each one glowing with soft internal light. Caregiver drones moved among them, tending to each one with careful attention. This was not a monster's lair. This was a nursery. The Queen's head turned toward Margaret as she entered the chamber. Her eyes were large and dark, filled with an intelligence that was both alien and unmistakably maternal. "You are not like the others," the Queen said. Her voice was soft, speaking directly into Margaret's mind rather than through the air. "They come with weapons and anger. You come with something else." Margaret walked slowly across the chamber, her footsteps making soft sounds on the organic floor. "I come as a mother," she said simply, "and grandmother. I recognize another mother when I see one." The Queen's vast consciousness recoiled in surprise. In her millions of years of existence, no enemy had ever spoken to her this way. "You know what I am?" "I know you're trying to feed your children," Margaret replied. "All of them." She gestured at the eggs around the throne. Then, at the walls that connected to the rest of the hive. "But feeding them has meant consuming others. That must be a terrible burden to carry." For the first time in eons, the Devourer Queen felt understood. The hive mind had always been focused on survival, growth, expansion, but at its heart, it had always been about this: keeping her children alive. "They are hungry," the Queen said, and her mental voice carried the weight of endless worry. Always hungry. The hive grows, and more are born, and they all need food. We must consume, or they will starve. Margaret nodded sympathetically. I raised 5 children during some very difficult times. I understand about never having enough food, about lying awake at night, worrying if there would be enough for tomorrow. She sat down on the floor near the throne, as if visiting a neighbor's living room. The casual gesture shocked the queen more than any weapon could have. But consuming other worlds isn't sustainable, Margaret continued gently. Eventually, you'll run out of places to find food. And then what happens to your children? The queen's tendrils writhed with distress. This is all I know. This is all we have ever done. The strong consume the weak. The hive grows, or it dies. What if there was another way? Margaret asked. What if instead of taking food, you could make it? Back on Earth, we learned how to grow more than we needed. We learned how to share knowledge instead of fighting over resources. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device, a tablet loaded with agricultural data. This contains information about sustainable farming, population management, and resource allocation. Techniques that could feed your hive without destroying other worlds. The queen stared at the tablet as if it were an alien artifact. You would share this knowledge, even though we have destroyed your allies' worlds? Because you destroyed worlds, Margaret corrected. Mothers don't let their children go hungry, even if they've made mistakes in the past. They teach them better ways to solve their problems. Through her connection to the hive mind, the queen could sense that the battle above was reaching its climax. The alien warriors were fighting with incredible skill and bravery. But they were outnumbered. Soon, the hive's defenses would overwhelm them. Your warriors will die, the queen said sadly. My children will destroy them to protect the hive. They don't have to, Margaret replied. You could call off the attack. You could choose to try something different. And if your new methods fail, if my children starve? Margaret smiled the same gentle smile she had given to 5 worried children over the years. Then we'll figure out something else. That's what families do. They work together to solve problems. They don't give up on each other. They're really Roblin. They work today. Then we'll figure out something else. They don't give up on each other. They work today. They work together. They work together to solve problems. They work. The queen was silent for a long moment, her vast mind processing this unprecedented concept. Through her tendrils, she could feel the individual thoughts that Margaret's kindness had awakened throughout the hive. Worker drones wondering what it felt like to choose their own tasks. Caregiver drones, imagining a world where their young could grow up without fear. You truly believe this could work? The queen asked. I believe it's worth trying, Margaret replied. The other way, the fighting and consuming, that's just going to end with everyone dead, including your children. This way, at least there's hope. The queen's decision rippled through the hive mind like an earthquake. For the first time in her existence, she chose cooperation over consumption, trust over dominance. The sounds of battle above began to fade as the Devourer warriors received new orders, not to destroy, but to withdraw. Not to consume, but to protect. Margaret pulled out her thermos and poured 2 cups of tea. Now then, she said, offering one to the queen. Let's talk about sustainable population growth and agricultural planning. I think you'll find it much less stressful than galactic conquest. The silence that fell over the hive was unlike anything the galaxy's greatest warriors had ever experienced. One moment they were fighting for their lives against endless waves of devourer attackers. The next moment, their enemies simply stopped. Grimjaw stood in a tunnel filled with the remains of his battles, his fur matted with alien blood, his claws still extended. Around him lay the bodies of dozens of devourer warriors. But the living ones had suddenly backed away, chittering to each other in confusion. What trick is this? He growled. But even as he spoke, he could see that the creatures were no longer focused on him. They seemed to be listening to something only they could hear. Combat Unit 7's tactical systems were running at maximum efficiency, trying to process what was happening. According to his calculations, the enemy should be pressing their advantage. Instead, they were withdrawing. Error in enemy behavior patterns, he reported through his communicator. Tactical retreat appears to be coordinated, but without strategic purpose. General Pirion emerged from a chamber where he had melted through 3 separate waves of defenders. His crystal body was still glowing white-hot from combat, but the enemies around him were moving away rather than attacking. "The flames of war grow cold," he said, confusion evident in his crackling voice. Throughout the hive complex, the same scene was repeated. The galaxy's most deadly warriors found themselves standing unopposed as their enemies retreated into side passages and sealed chambers. Captain Voss's voice crackled through their communicators from the ship above. "All units, report status. We're reading massive changes in the hive's energy patterns. What's happening down there?" "Unknown," Combat Unit 7 replied. "Enemy withdrawal in progress. No apparent cause." What none of them knew was that deep in the hive's heart, 2 mothers were sharing tea and discussing the future of an entire species. Margaret had spread papers across the floor of the Queen's chamber, showing charts and graphs about agricultural yields and population sustainability. The Queen studied them with fascination, her vast intellect quickly grasping concepts that had taken human civilizations centuries to develop. "These crop rotation methods," the Queen said, her mental voice filled with wonder. "They actually increase yield over time, rather than depleting the soil." "That's right, dear," Margaret replied, pouring more tea. "It seems counterintuitive at first, letting fields rest instead of using them constantly. But the soil needs time to recover, just like people do." The Queen's tendrils pulsed with new understanding. "We have been mining worlds like minerals, taking everything until nothing remains. But you speak of cultivation, of partnership with the environment. It's more work at first," Margaret admitted. "But it lasts forever. Your children's children's children will still be able to eat well." Through the hive mind, the Queen began transmitting these new concepts to her entire species. Billions of devourers across the galaxy suddenly experienced thoughts they had never had before. Planning for the future. Considering consequences. Thinking about sustainability, rather than just immediate consumption. Above them, the warriors were slowly making their way toward the hive's center, following the directions from their original briefing. They expected to find a final, desperate battle. Instead, they found corridors filled with devourers, who watched them pass with curiosity rather than hostility. "This is highly irregular," Combat Unit 7 observed as a group of warrior drones stepped aside to let them through. "The pack does not understand," Grimjaw rumbled, but he kept his claws sheathed. Fighting an enemy that wouldn't fight back went against every instinct he had. But even he could sense that something fundamental had changed. When the warriors finally reached the Queen's chamber, they burst through the entrance, ready for the battle of their lives. Instead, they found Margaret sitting cross-legged on the floor, sharing cookies with the most dangerous being in the galaxy. "Oh, there you are," Margaret called out cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I was just about to make another pot of tea. I hope everyone's all right. You all look a bit worse for wear." Grimjaw's jaw dropped open. Behind him, the other warriors stood in stunned silence. The Queen, who they had come to kill, was looking at them with what could only be described as polite interest. "Please, sit down," the Queen said, her mental voice reaching all of them at once. "Your grandmother has been teaching me remarkable things." "Grandmother?" General Pirion's voice cracked with confusion. "That's what she asked me to call her," the Queen explained. "She says that anyone old enough to worry about children is old enough to be a grandmother, regardless of species." Margaret stood up and began unpacking medical supplies from her bag. "Now, let me have a look at those wounds." "Goodness, Alpha Grimjaw, you've been bleeding all over yourself. That can't be sanitary." Grimjaw backed away instinctively. "Human female. What sorcery is this? Why does the Queen not attack?" "Because we've been talking," Margaret replied simply, approaching him with antiseptic and bandages. "Really talking, not just making threats and demands. Hold still, this might sting a little." Despite himself, Grimjaw found himself sitting on the floor while Margaret cleaned and bandaged his wounds. The sensation was so foreign to his warrior culture that he couldn't process it. When was the last time someone had cared for his injuries rather than simply expecting him to ignore them? "I don't understand," Combat Unit 7 said, his red eyes flashing as he tried to calculate the situation. Mission parameters: specified elimination of hostile entity. Why are we having tea? The Queen's vast form shifted, her attention focusing on the Zephyrian. "Because your grandmother helped me understand that my children and I don't have to be hostile. We were consuming other worlds because we didn't know any other way to survive. But there are alternatives." She gestured to the papers scattered around Margaret's sitting area. Sustainable agriculture, population management, resource sharing, interstellar trade agreements, methods for feeding my species without destroying others. Margaret handed General Pyrion a cup of tea, carefully using heat-resistant materials. "The general idea is that instead of fighting each other for resources, we work together to create more resources. Everyone benefits. Everyone survives." "The flames of war," Pyrion began, then stopped. "I do not understand these concepts." "That's all right, dear," Margaret said kindly. "It took humans a long time to learn them too. We spent thousands of years fighting each other before we figured out that cooperation worked better than conquest." One by one, the warriors found themselves sitting in the Queen's chamber, accepting food and medical care while Margaret and the Queen explained their new agreement. The hive would cease its expansion immediately. In exchange, the galactic community would share agricultural technology and help establish sustainable colonies on uninhabited worlds. "But the other species," Grimjaw said slowly, his warrior mind struggling with these new ideas. "They will not trust the Devourers. Too much blood has been spilled." "That's where you all come in," Margaret replied. "You're not just the galaxy's greatest warriors. You're also its most respected representatives. When you go back and tell your people that the Queen can be trusted, they'll listen." The Queen's mental voice carried a note of hope. "And, perhaps, in time, they will understand that we were never truly evil. We were simply hungry and afraid." Margaret packed up her papers and stood, dusting off her sweater. "Now, I should probably call my son and let him know I'll be home soon. I promised to babysit my granddaughter next week, and she gets very upset when people are late." She looked around at the assembled warriors and the massive alien Queen. "This has been lovely, but next time, maybe we could try talking first before sending warriors. It would save everyone a lot of trouble." Admiral Korath's voice crackled through their communicators from the ship above. "Strike team, report status. We're reading impossible energy signatures from your location." Grimjaw picked up the communicator with hands that were still shaking slightly. "Admiral," he said slowly, "the mission is complete. But not in the way we expected." Explain." Grimjaw looked at Margaret, who was now knitting while casually chatting with a being that had terrorized the galaxy. "The human grandmother," he said finally. She made friends. Later, as they prepared to leave the Queen's world, Combat Unit 7 approached Margaret. "This unit requires clarification. How did you know that negotiation would succeed where warfare failed?" Margaret smiled and patted his metal arm gently. "Because, dear, I've learned that most problems aren't really about fighting. They're about fear and loneliness and not knowing how to ask for help. Once you address those, the fighting usually stops on its own." She shouldered her bag and headed toward the exit. "Besides," she added over her shoulder, "anyone who's raised teenagers knows that sometimes the most rebellious behavior comes from the ones who need the most love." Behind them, the Devourer Queen watched their departure with something that might have been a smile. For the first time in her long existence, she looked forward to tomorrow. Not because of what she might conquer, but because of what she might build. And throughout the galaxy, the story would be told for generations. How the greatest warriors in history were assembled to fight the ultimate enemy. But it was a grandmother with cookies and common sense who actually won the war.